Question 1. The control framework reveals that an individual has been convicted of a serious terrorism-related offense in Alabama. As a legal professional tasked with recommending a sentence, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with Alabama's sentencing guidelines for terrorism-related offenses? Option A. Focus primarily on the defendant's expressed remorse and potential for rehabilitation, recommending a sentence that emphasizes restorative justice and minimizes incarceration, even if it deviates from the standard sentencing guidelines for such offenses. Option B. Base the sentencing recommendation on prevailing public sentiment and media coverage of the case, aiming to satisfy public demand for retribution against those convicted of terrorism. Option C. Advocate for the imposition of the maximum statutory penalty available for the offense, arguing that the severity of terrorism-related crimes warrants the harshest possible punishment regardless of individual circumstances. Option D. Conduct a thorough review of the Alabama sentencing guidelines for terrorism-related offenses, considering all statutory aggravating and mitigating factors, the nature and impact of the offense, the defendant's criminal history, and the potential for recidivism, to propose a sentence that is proportionate and serves the interests of justice and public safety. Correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough review of the Alabama sentencing guidelines for terrorism-related offenses, considering all statutory aggravating and mitigating factors, the nature and impact of the offense, the defendant's criminal history, and the potential for recidivism, to propose a sentence that is proportionate and serves the interests of justice and public safety. Explanation. The control framework reveals a complex scenario involving the sentencing of an individual convicted of terrorism-related offenses under Alabama law. This situation is professionally challenging due to the gravity of the offenses, the potential for significant public safety implications, and the need to balance punitive measures with rehabilitation and victim considerations, all within the specific confines of Alabama's sentencing statutes and guidelines for terrorism. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the sentence imposed is just, effective, and compliant with all applicable legal standards. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive assessment of all relevant factors, including the severity and impact of the offense, the defendant's criminal history, any mitigating or aggravating circumstances, and the potential for recidivism, while strictly adhering to the Alabama sentencing guidelines for terrorism-related offenses. This approach is correct because it prioritizes a fact-specific, legally compliant determination of an appropriate sentence. Alabama law, particularly as it pertains to terrorism, emphasizes proportionality and public safety. The Alabama sentencing guidelines provide a structured framework to ensure consistency and fairness, requiring judges to consider statutory factors and case law when imposing sentences for these serious crimes. This methodical process ensures that the sentence serves the goals of punishment, deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation, as mandated by the state's penal code. An approach that focuses solely on the maximum statutory penalty without considering individual circumstances or the specific nuances of the Alabama sentencing guidelines is professionally unacceptable. This failure to engage with the established guidelines represents a disregard for the legislative intent to provide a structured and equitable sentencing process. It risks imposing a sentence that is either unduly harsh or fails to adequately address the specific nature of the crime and the offender. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to prioritize the defendant's perceived remorse or potential for rehabilitation above all other factors, to the exclusion of the severity of the terrorism-related offense and its impact on victims and society. While rehabilitation is a component of sentencing, it cannot override the fundamental need for public protection and just punishment for acts that threaten the security of the state and its citizens, as outlined in Alabama's terrorism statutes. Finally, an approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or public opinion rather than the established legal framework and evidence presented in court is ethically and legally flawed. Sentencing decisions must be grounded in objective legal standards and factual evidence, not on subjective or external pressures, to maintain the integrity of the judicial process and ensure that justice is administered impartially under Alabama law. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the specific Alabama statutes and sentencing guidelines applicable to terrorism offenses. This involves meticulously reviewing the evidence, considering all statutory aggravating and mitigating factors, consulting relevant case law, and engaging in a reasoned application of the guidelines to the facts of the case. The process should be transparent, documented, and focused on achieving a just and legally sound outcome that upholds the principles of public safety and due process within the Alabama legal system. Question 2. The audit findings indicate a potential gap in the organization's adherence to Australian counterterrorism financing laws, specifically regarding the identification and reporting of suspicious transactions. Which of the following risk assessment approaches best addresses this concern? Option A. Prioritizing customer convenience and speed of transaction processing above all other considerations during the risk assessment process. Option B. Focusing the risk assessment primarily on the volume of transactions, assuming that higher volumes inherently carry greater counterterrorism financing risk. Option C. Implementing a comprehensive risk assessment framework that systematically evaluates the likelihood and impact of various counterterrorism financing risks across all business operations, identifying potential red flags, and assessing the effectiveness of existing controls. Option D. Relying exclusively on automated transaction monitoring systems to generate alerts for suspicious activity, with minimal human oversight. The correct answer is C. Implementing a comprehensive risk assessment framework that systematically evaluates the likelihood and impact of various counterterrorism financing risks across all business operations, identifying potential red flags, and assessing the effectiveness of existing controls. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a potential vulnerability in the organization's adherence to Australian counterterrorism financing laws, specifically concerning the identification and reporting of suspicious activities. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of the Australian Transaction Reports and Analysis Centre, AUSTRAC, guidelines and the broader legislative framework designed to prevent the financing of terrorism. Professionals must balance operational efficiency with robust compliance, ensuring that reporting obligations are met without unduly disrupting legitimate business activities. The risk assessment process is critical in identifying and mitigating these vulnerabilities. The best approach involves a comprehensive risk assessment that systematically evaluates the likelihood and impact of various counterterrorism financing risks across all business operations. This includes identifying potential red flags, assessing the effectiveness of existing controls, and prioritizing areas for enhanced vigilance and reporting. This approach aligns directly with the principles of the Anti-Money Laundering and Counterterrorism Financing Act 2006, CTH, and AUSTRAC guidance, which mandate a risk-based approach to compliance. By proactively identifying and assessing risks, organizations can implement targeted controls and reporting mechanisms, thereby fulfilling their legal obligations and contributing to national security. An approach that focuses solely on transaction volume, without considering the context or nature of the transactions, is flawed. This overlooks the possibility that low volume, high value, or unusual transactions can be indicative of illicit activity. Such an approach fails to meet the risk-based obligations under Australian law, which requires a deeper analysis than mere quantitative metrics. Another unacceptable approach is to rely exclusively on automated alerts without human oversight and judgment. While automation can be a useful tool, it cannot replace the critical thinking and contextual understanding that a trained compliance officer brings to identifying suspicious activity. Over-reliance on technology without human intervention can lead to missed red flags or the misinterpretation of legitimate transactions as suspicious, both of which are detrimental to effective counterterrorism financing efforts and compliance. Finally, an approach that prioritizes customer convenience over compliance obligations is fundamentally unsound. While customer experience is important, it must not come at the expense of adhering to legal requirements designed to protect the financial system from abuse. This approach demonstrates a disregard for the seriousness of counterterrorism financing and the legal imperative to report suspicious activities. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the regulatory landscape, including the specific obligations under Australian counterterrorism financing laws. This should be followed by a thorough risk assessment process that considers both the likelihood and impact of identified risks. Based on this assessment, appropriate controls and reporting procedures should be designed and implemented. Regular review and testing of these controls are essential to ensure their ongoing effectiveness and to adapt to evolving threats and regulatory expectations. Question 3. The monitoring system demonstrates an increase in online chatter related to extremist ideologies within Alabama. Considering the principles of domestic counterterrorism laws and policies in Alabama, which of the following risk assessment approaches is most appropriate for guiding subsequent investigative actions? Option A. Rely primarily on anonymous tips and general intelligence reports about extremist activity to direct law enforcement resources towards areas with higher reported incidents. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment that analyzes the content of the chatter for specific threats, identifies potential actors based on verifiable indicators of intent and capability, and considers the broader context of the information within Alabama's security landscape. Option C. Prioritize immediate physical surveillance of all individuals identified as having engaged in the online chatter, regardless of the specific nature or severity of their communications. Option D. Immediately initiate surveillance on individuals or groups whose online profiles align with common demographic stereotypes associated with extremist movements. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment that analyzes the content of the chatter for specific threats, identifies potential actors based on verifiable indicators of intent and capability, and considers the broader context of the information within Alabama's security landscape. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for proactive threat identification with the protection of individual liberties and the avoidance of profiling. The Alabama Counterterrorism Law exam demands a nuanced understanding of how to interpret intelligence without succumbing to bias or overreach. Careful judgment is required to ensure that risk assessments are evidence-based and legally sound, adhering strictly to Alabama's domestic counterterrorism legal framework. The best approach involves a comprehensive, multifaceted risk assessment that considers a broad range of indicators and contextual factors. This method is correct because it aligns with the principles of due process and equal protection, emphasizing objective evidence over subjective assumptions. Alabama law, like federal guidelines, mandates that counterterrorism efforts be grounded in credible intelligence and avoid discriminatory practices. This approach ensures that resources are focused on genuine threats while minimizing the risk of misidentification and unwarranted scrutiny of individuals or groups based on protected characteristics. It promotes a systematic evaluation of potential threats by analyzing patterns of behavior, stated intentions, and access to means, all within the legal boundaries established by Alabama statutes concerning domestic security and law enforcement. An approach that focuses solely on demographic characteristics or perceived ideologies is professionally unacceptable. This is because it directly violates the principle of non-discrimination, which is a cornerstone of both ethical law enforcement and Alabama's legal framework. Such an approach risks leading to profiling, which is not only ineffective in identifying actual threats, but also erodes public trust and can result in civil rights violations. Furthermore, relying on broad generalizations rather than specific, actionable intelligence is a failure to adhere to the evidence-based standards required for effective counterterrorism. Another unacceptable approach is one that prioritizes immediate, reactive measures based on vague suspicions without a thorough, documented risk assessment. This can lead to an overallocation of resources, potential harassment of innocent individuals, and a failure to address the root causes or more sophisticated aspects of potential threats. It bypasses the necessary legal and procedural safeguards designed to ensure that counterterrorism actions are proportionate and justified. Finally, an approach that relies heavily on informant tips without independent corroboration or a structured assessment process is also flawed. While informants can be valuable sources of information, their tips must be rigorously vetted and integrated into a broader intelligence picture. Unverified information, if acted upon exclusively, can lead to erroneous conclusions and misdirected efforts, failing to meet the legal standard for initiating significant counterterrorism actions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with the collection of all available, credible intelligence. This intelligence should then be subjected to a structured risk assessment process that evaluates potential threats based on objective criteria, considering intent, capability, and opportunity. This assessment must be continuously reviewed and updated as new information becomes available. Throughout this process, adherence to legal statutes ethical guidelines and principles of fairness is paramount, ensuring that all actions are justifiable and proportionate to the identified risk. Question 4. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need to enhance Alabama's compliance with United Nations resolutions on counterterrorism. Considering the state's existing legal framework and operational capabilities, what is the most effective strategy for integrating these international obligations into state-level counterterrorism efforts? Option A. Amend Alabama's criminal statutes to directly incorporate the exact wording of applicable UN counterterrorism resolutions, without further consideration for existing state laws or operational feasibility. Option B. Implement broad, nonspecific surveillance measures across Alabama, justified by the general intent of UN counterterrorism resolutions, without establishing clear legal predicates or oversight mechanisms. Option C. Defer all counterterrorism implementation efforts related to UN resolutions to federal agencies, assuming their actions will adequately address state-level compliance. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive review of relevant UN Security Council resolutions and develop specific Alabama-based policies, training programs, and interagency protocols to align with these mandates, ensuring practical implementation and legal consistency. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive review of relevant UN Security Council resolutions and develop specific Alabama-based policies, training programs, and interagency protocols to align with these mandates, ensuring practical implementation and legal consistency. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing national security imperatives with the practicalities of implementing international obligations under United Nations resolutions on counterterrorism within Alabama's specific legal and operational context. The challenge lies in translating broad international mandates into actionable, compliant, and effective domestic strategies without overstepping existing state authority or creating undue burdens on individuals and businesses. Careful judgment is required to ensure that counterterrorism efforts are both robust and legally sound, respecting due process and civil liberties. The best approach involves a comprehensive review and integration of relevant UN Security Council resolutions, such as UNSCR 1373, into Alabama's existing counterterrorism frameworks. This includes identifying specific legislative gaps, developing targeted training programs for state and local law enforcement agencies on identifying and reporting suspicious financial activities related to terrorism, and establishing clear protocols for information sharing with federal agencies and international partners. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the requirement to implement UN resolutions by aligning them with Alabama's specific legal and administrative structures, ensuring a coordinated and lawful response. It prioritizes a proactive, informed, and legally grounded strategy that respects the sovereignty of Alabama while fulfilling international commitments, an approach that focuses solely on amending Alabama's criminal code to mirror the language of UN resolutions without considering practical implementation or existing state statutes would be professionally unacceptable. This fails to account for the nuances of state-level law enforcement and the potential for unintended consequences or legal challenges. It also neglects the crucial step of developing operational guidelines and training, rendering the legislative changes ineffective in practice. Another unacceptable approach would be to rely exclusively on federal guidance and enforcement without actively seeking to integrate UN resolution requirements into Alabama's specific counterterrorism planning and resource allocation. While federal cooperation is vital, states have a responsibility to ensure their own frameworks are compliant and effective. This approach risks creating a fragmented response and overlooks opportunities for state-specific innovation and adaptation. Finally, an approach that prioritizes broad surveillance measures without clear legal justification or oversight, purportedly in response to UN resolutions, would be ethically and legally flawed. UN resolutions on counterterrorism emphasize the importance of respecting human rights and fundamental freedoms. Such an approach would likely violate Alabama constitutional protections and due process rights, undermining the legitimacy of counterterrorism efforts. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the specific UN resolutions applicable to counterterrorism. This should be followed by a detailed assessment of Alabama's current legal and operational landscape, identifying areas where existing frameworks align with or diverge from international obligations. Collaboration with legal counsel, law enforcement agencies, and relevant stakeholders at both state and federal levels is crucial. The process should involve developing concrete action plans, including legislative proposals, policy changes, training initiatives, and resource allocation, all while ensuring adherence to constitutional principles and civil liberties. Question 5. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need to refine the operational definition and scope of counterterrorism law enforcement activities within Alabama. Considering the Alabama Counterterrorism Act and its implementing guidelines, which of the following approaches best balances the imperative to prevent terrorist attacks with the protection of civil liberties and the avoidance of discriminatory practices? Option A. Rely solely on the analysis of publicly available information and social media trends to identify potential threats, without initiating further legally authorized investigative steps when initial indicators are present. Option B. Focus investigative efforts primarily on individuals or communities exhibiting specific religious or ethnic affiliations, based on generalized concerns about potential radicalization, without requiring concrete evidence of illegal activity. Option C. Prioritize threat assessments based on specific, actionable intelligence and observable behaviors directly linked to the planning or preparation of terrorist acts, as defined by Alabama statutes, while ensuring all investigations adhere to due process and non-discriminatory principles. Option D. Adopt a passive stance, avoiding any proactive surveillance or investigation, even when specific intelligence suggests a potential threat, due to concerns about potential overreach and public perception. The correct answer is C. Prioritize threat assessments based on specific, actionable intelligence and observable behaviors directly linked to the planning or preparation of terrorist acts, as defined by Alabama statutes, while ensuring all investigations adhere to due process and non-discriminatory principles. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for robust counterterrorism measures with the protection of civil liberties and the avoidance of profiling. Law enforcement and intelligence agencies in Alabama operate under the Alabama Counterterrorism Act and related federal statutes, which mandate vigilance against terrorist threats while also emphasizing due process and non-discrimination. The challenge lies in identifying genuine threats without resorting to practices that could be perceived as discriminatory or that overstep legal boundaries, potentially leading to legal challenges and erosion of public trust. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves a comprehensive threat assessment that relies on specific, credible intelligence and observable behaviors indicative of planning or preparation for terrorist acts, as defined by Alabama law. This approach prioritizes objective evidence over generalized suspicion or demographic profiling. It aligns with the Alabama Counterterrorism Act's intent to combat terrorism effectively while upholding constitutional rights and preventing the misuse of law enforcement powers. This method ensures that resources are focused on genuine threats and that investigations are legally sound and ethically defensible. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to focus solely on individuals or groups exhibiting certain religious or ethnic characteristics, based on broad, unsubstantiated fears of terrorism. This constitutes profiling, which is not only ethically problematic but also legally impermissible under Alabama and federal law, as it violates equal protection principles and can lead to discriminatory enforcement. Such an approach is ineffective as it diverts attention from actual threats and can alienate communities essential for intelligence gathering. Another incorrect approach is to disregard potential threats due to a reluctance to engage in any form of surveillance or investigation that might be perceived as intrusive, even when supported by specific intelligence. While respecting privacy is crucial, a complete avoidance of necessary investigative steps, when warranted by credible information and legal authority, can leave the state vulnerable to attack. This passive stance fails to meet the proactive obligations of counterterrorism efforts as outlined in relevant statutes. A third incorrect approach is to rely exclusively on publicly available information without conducting further, legally permissible investigative steps when initial indicators suggest a potential threat. While open-source intelligence is valuable, it is often insufficient on its own to confirm or deny a threat. A failure to pursue further, authorized investigative avenues when red flags are raised, based on a misinterpretation of privacy concerns or a lack of understanding of investigative protocols, can result in missed opportunities to prevent harm. Professional reasoning. Professionals must adopt a decision-making framework that integrates legal mandates, ethical considerations, and practical intelligence. This involves a continuous cycle of intelligence gathering, analysis, and action, always grounded in objective evidence and legal authority. When faced with potential threats, professionals should ask, is there specific, credible intelligence? Does this intelligence point to a violation of Alabama or federal law? Are the proposed investigative steps legally authorized and ethically sound? Is the approach free from discriminatory bias? This systematic evaluation ensures that counterterrorism efforts are both effective and lawful. Question 6. Market research demonstrates a growing concern among Alabama residents regarding potential domestic extremist threats. A local business owner in Birmingham, Alabama, reports observing unusual and potentially concerning patterns of behavior by individuals frequenting their establishment, including discussions that hint at planning disruptive activities. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the business owner to take under the Alabama Counterterrorism Act? Option A. Initiate an independent, informal surveillance operation to gather more concrete evidence before reporting the activity to authorities. Option B. Share the observed concerns and details with other local business owners and community leaders to foster a collective response. Option C. Immediately contact the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency, ALEA, and the local FBI field office, providing all observed details and cooperating fully with their established protocols for threat assessment and investigation. Option D. Post anonymized details of the suspicious activity on social media to alert the wider public and encourage vigilance. The correct answer is C. Immediately contact the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency, ALEA, and the local FBI field office, providing all observed details and cooperating fully with their established protocols for threat assessment and investigation. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for information with the stringent legal and ethical obligations under Alabama's counterterrorism laws. The pressure to act quickly in a potential threat situation can lead to shortcuts that violate established protocols, potentially compromising evidence integrity or infringing on individual rights. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions are both effective in preventing terrorism and legally sound. The best approach involves a multi-agency, coordinated response that prioritizes information sharing within established legal frameworks. This means immediately notifying the appropriate Alabama law enforcement agencies and federal partners, such as the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, while adhering strictly to the Alabama Counterterrorism Act's provisions regarding evidence collection, surveillance, and data handling. This approach ensures that all actions are authorized, documented, and conducted by personnel with the requisite legal authority and training, thereby safeguarding the investigation and respecting civil liberties. An approach that bypasses established interagency communication channels and directly attempts to gather information through unauthorized means, such as unauthorized surveillance or data access, is professionally unacceptable. This failure to involve the designated authorities and follow legal procedures violates the Alabama Counterterrorism Act, which outlines specific requirements for intelligence gathering and sharing. Such actions could lead to the inadmissibility of evidence, civil liability, and undermine the broader counterterrorism efforts by creating interagency distrust and potential legal challenges. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to delay reporting the suspicious activity to the relevant authorities, opting instead to conduct an independent, informal investigation. This inaction or deviation from protocol directly contravenes the spirit and letter of Alabama's counterterrorism laws, which mandate prompt reporting and coordinated action. The failure to engage the appropriate legal and investigative bodies in a timely manner could allow a potential threat to escalate and represents a dereliction of duty, potentially leading to severe consequences. Finally, an approach that involves sharing sensitive, unverified information with the public or unauthorized third parties before proper channels have been utilized is also professionally unacceptable. This premature disclosure can jeopardize an ongoing investigation, compromise operational security, and potentially incite panic or misinform the public, all of which are contrary to the responsible implementation of counterterrorism measures as envisioned by Alabama law. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with immediate threat assessment, followed by strict adherence to established protocols for reporting and information sharing. This framework emphasizes consulting legal counsel and relevant agency guidelines before taking any action that could have legal implications. Prioritizing lawful procedures, interagency cooperation, and evidence integrity ensures that responses are both effective and compliant with the Alabama Counterterrorism Act. Question 7. Risk assessment procedures indicate that the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency, ALEA, needs to enhance its collaborative intelligence sharing with a designated regional counterterrorism fusion center to improve threat detection and response capabilities across the state. Considering the specific legal and operational landscape of Alabama's counterterrorism efforts, which of the following approaches best facilitates this critical interagency cooperation? Option A. ALEA should unilaterally determine the scope and nature of information shared with the Fusion Center based solely on its own immediate operational priorities, without input from the Fusion Center regarding its intelligence requirements. Option B. Immediately disseminate all raw, unverified intelligence received by ALEA directly to the Fusion Center without any internal vetting or analysis. Option C. Develop and execute a formal Memorandum of Understanding (MOU) with the Regional Fusion Center that clearly outlines intelligence sharing protocols, data classification, designated points of contact, and verification procedures. Option D. Rely on informal verbal agreements and existing personal relationships between ALEA personnel and Fusion Center analysts for the exchange of sensitive counterterrorism information. The correct answer is C. Develop and execute a formal Memorandum of Understanding (MOU) with the Regional Fusion Center that clearly outlines intelligence sharing protocols, data classification, designated points of contact, and verification procedures. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent complexities of interagency cooperation in counterterrorism efforts within Alabama. Effective regional counterterrorism frameworks rely on seamless information sharing, coordinated response protocols, and mutual understanding of each agency's capabilities and limitations. The challenge lies in balancing the need for rapid information dissemination with the imperative to maintain operational security and adhere to established legal and procedural guidelines governing such exchanges. Careful judgment is required to ensure that information sharing enhances, rather than compromises, the overall counterterrorism posture. The best approach involves establishing a formal, documented Memorandum of Understanding (MOU) between the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency, ALEA, and the Regional Fusion Center. This MOU should clearly delineate the types of intelligence to be shared, the protocols for dissemination, the designated points of contact within each entity, and the procedures for verifying information accuracy and timeliness. This approach is correct because it provides a clear, legally sound, and procedurally robust framework for interagency cooperation, directly aligning with the principles of effective regional counterterrorism strategy as envisioned by Alabama's legislative intent to foster collaboration. It ensures accountability, transparency, and adherence to established information sharing standards, thereby maximizing the effectiveness of regional counterterrorism efforts, while mitigating risks associated with informal or ad hoc information exchanges. An approach that relies solely on informal verbal agreements and personal relationships between ALEA personnel and Fusion Center analysts is professionally unacceptable. This method lacks any formal documentation, making it difficult to establish accountability or ensure consistent application of information sharing protocols. It also creates significant risks of information being misinterpreted, mishandled, or not shared at all due to personnel changes or misunderstandings, potentially undermining critical counterterrorism operations and violating established information sharing guidelines. Another professionally unacceptable approach would be to prioritize the sharing of all raw, unverified intelligence immediately upon receipt, without any internal vetting or analysis by ALEA. While speed is important in counterterrorism, disseminating unverified information can lead to misallocation of resources, false alarms, and damage to the credibility of both agencies. This approach fails to acknowledge the importance of intelligence analysis and verification, which are crucial steps in transforming raw data into actionable intelligence and could violate protocols designed to prevent the spread of misinformation. Finally, an approach where ALIA unilaterally decides what information is relevant to the fusion center without consulting the center's operational needs or established intelligence priorities is also professionally flawed. This can lead to the fusion center being overwhelmed with irrelevant data or missing critical pieces of intelligence that do not align with ALIA's immediate focus. Effective regional frameworks require a collaborative understanding of shared threats and intelligence requirements, not a one-sided dissemination of information. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with identifying the specific counterterrorism objectives and the legal and regulatory framework governing interagency cooperation in Alabama. This involves understanding the mandates of ALIA and the role of regional fusion centers. The next step is to assess the risks and benefits of various information-sharing mechanisms, prioritizing those that offer clarity, accountability, and compliance with established protocols. Developing or adhering to formal agreements such as MOUs should be the primary consideration, ensuring that all parties understand their roles, responsibilities, and the procedures for effective and secure information exchange. Question 8. The performance metrics show an increasing trend in potential international terrorist threats requiring immediate information sharing with a foreign partner nation. Alabama law enforcement agencies have received a request for sensitive intelligence that could be crucial in preventing an imminent attack. However, the request is being made under the general framework of an international counterterrorism convention, to which the United States is a signatory, and the specific provisions regarding the scope and limitations of such information sharing are not immediately clear to the local officers. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency? Option A. Seek formal legal interpretation from the Alabama Attorney General's Office or the U.S. Department of Justice regarding the specific obligations and limitations under the International Convention before proceeding with any information sharing. Option B. Assume that the International Convention grants broad authority for information sharing in counterterrorism matters and share the intelligence without further legal consultation. Option C. Share the intelligence only with the understanding that Alabama law enforcement's primary duty is to protect state residents, and international treaty obligations are secondary to immediate security concerns. Option D. Proceed with sharing the requested intelligence immediately, prioritizing the prevention of the imminent attack over the detailed legal review of the International Convention's provisions. The correct answer is A. Seek formal legal interpretation from the Alabama Attorney General's Office or the U.S. Department of Justice regarding the specific obligations and limitations under the International Convention before proceeding with any information sharing. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between national security imperatives and the principles of international cooperation enshrined in treaties. Alabama law enforcement agencies, while tasked with combating terrorism, must operate within a framework that respects international legal obligations. Misinterpreting or disregarding these obligations can lead to diplomatic friction, hinder future intelligence sharing, and potentially undermine the very counterterrorism efforts they aim to support. The challenge lies in balancing immediate operational needs with long-term international legal commitments. Correct approach analysis. The most appropriate approach involves seeking formal legal counsel from the Alabama Attorney General's Office or the U.S. Department of Justice to interpret the applicability and implications of the relevant international counterterrorism conventions. This approach is correct because it acknowledges the supremacy of federal law and international treaty obligations over state-level operational directives when such conflicts arise. Federal agencies are responsible for the interpretation and implementation of international treaties ratified by the United States. Engaging these bodies ensures that any actions taken are compliant with both U.S. federal law and international commitments, thereby avoiding potential legal challenges and diplomatic repercussions. This aligns with the principle that state actions must not contravene federal treaty obligations. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with information sharing based solely on the perceived urgency of the threat, without consulting legal experts on the treaty's specific provisions regarding information exchange with the foreign nation. This fails to account for potential limitations or conditions stipulated within the convention, such as data privacy safeguards or mutual legal assistance requirements, which could render the sharing unlawful or diplomatically problematic. Another incorrect approach is to assume that the International Convention automatically grants unfettered access to all information, regardless of the specific nature of the data or the requesting entity's authority under the Convention. This overlooks the nuanced legal frameworks that govern international cooperation, which often involve protocols and specific authorization procedures to prevent misuse of shared information and to uphold the sovereignty of other nations. A further incorrect approach is to prioritize state-level counterterrorism directives over the potential implications of international treaty obligations, believing that state interests supersede international law in this context. This fundamentally misunderstands the hierarchy of laws in the United States, where ratified treaties are considered the supreme law of the land, alongside federal statutes. State agencies are bound by these obligations. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a dilemma should first identify the potential conflict between operational objectives and international legal obligations. They should then consult their internal legal advisors or relevant federal agencies to clarify the precise requirements and limitations imposed by the international treaty. A systematic approach involving legal interpretation, risk assessment, and consultation with appropriate authorities is crucial to ensure lawful and effective counterterrorism operations that respect both national security needs and international commitments. Question 9. Stakeholder feedback indicates a growing concern regarding the potential for overreach when implementing new surveillance technologies for counterterrorism purposes within Alabama. Considering the specific legislative framework governing counterterrorism efforts in Alabama, which of the following approaches best balances the need for enhanced security with the protection of individual liberties? Option A. Rely solely on the recommendations of technology vendors and federal guidelines for implementation, assuming compliance with Alabama's specific legal requirements. Option B. Immediately deploy the new surveillance technology to maximize its potential security benefits, with a plan to address any legal or privacy concerns that may arise after implementation. Option C. Implement the surveillance technology with minimal public disclosure, focusing only on internal operational guidelines to ensure its effective use for counterterrorism. Option D. Conduct a thorough legal review of the proposed surveillance technology against Alabama's counterterrorism statutes and privacy laws, followed by a public consultation process to address community concerns and gather input before deployment. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough legal review of the proposed surveillance technology against Alabama's counterterrorism statutes and privacy laws, followed by a public consultation process to address community concerns and gather input before deployment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the critical need to balance effective counterterrorism measures with the protection of civil liberties and privacy rights, as mandated by Alabama law. The implementation of new surveillance technologies requires careful consideration of legal boundaries, potential for misuse, and the public's right to privacy. Missteps can lead to legal challenges, erosion of public trust, and ineffectiveness of the counterterrorism efforts themselves. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive legal review and public consultation process before deploying new surveillance technologies. This approach ensures that any proposed technology aligns with the specific provisions of Alabama's counterterrorism legislation, including any limitations on data collection, retention, and usage. Engaging the public and relevant stakeholders fosters transparency, builds trust, and allows for the incorporation of diverse perspectives, thereby mitigating potential legal and ethical risks. This proactive stance is crucial for demonstrating adherence to the spirit and letter of the law, particularly concerning due process and privacy protections. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves prioritizing the perceived immediate security benefits of a surveillance technology without a thorough legal vetting process. This overlooks the statutory requirements and potential constitutional challenges that could render the technology's use unlawful and ineffective. Another flawed approach is to proceed with implementation based solely on recommendations from technology vendors, neglecting independent legal counsel and Alabama-specific regulatory frameworks. This creates a significant risk of non-compliance and potential legal repercussions. Finally, implementing the technology without any form of public or stakeholder engagement, even if legally permissible, undermines transparency and can lead to public opposition and distrust, hindering the overall effectiveness of counterterrorism efforts. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a decision should adopt a framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant Alabama counterterrorism laws and constitutional protections. This should be followed by a detailed assessment of the proposed technology's capabilities and limitations in relation to these legal requirements. Seeking expert legal advice is paramount. Furthermore, a commitment to transparency and public engagement, where appropriate and legally feasible, is essential for building consensus and ensuring long-term success. Question 10. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing enhanced security measures at Alabama's critical infrastructure sites, such as ports and energy facilities, could cost an estimated $75 million annually. If the probability of a significant terrorist attack at these sites is estimated at $0.02 per year, and the estimated economic and human cost of such an attack is $4 billion, what is the minimum annual benefit required to justify the proposed security expenditure, assuming a linear relationship between benefit and cost? Option A. An annual benefit of at least $75 million, representing the direct cost of the security measures. Option B. An annual benefit of at least $4 billion, representing the total potential cost of an attack. Option C. An annual benefit of at least $78 million, calculated as $0.02 times $4,000,000,000,000 plus $30,000,000,000. Assuming a reduced implementation cost. Option D. An annual benefit of at least $80 million, calculated as $0.02 times $4,000,000,000,000 plus $75,000,000,000. The correct answer is D. An annual benefit of at least $80 million, calculated as $0.02 times $4,000,000,000,000 plus $75,000,000,000. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge in resource allocation for counterterrorism efforts within Alabama. The difficulty lies in quantifying the intangible benefits of preventative measures against the concrete costs of implementation, especially when dealing with potential threats that may or may not materialize. Balancing fiscal responsibility with public safety mandates requires a rigorous and justifiable methodology. The historical context of counterterrorism legislation in Alabama, while providing a framework, does not offer a precise formula for this specific budgetary decision, necessitating careful interpretation and application of principles. Correct approach analysis. The most professionally sound approach involves a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis that quantifies both direct and indirect costs associated with implementing enhanced security measures at critical infrastructure sites. This includes the cost of personnel, technology, training, and ongoing maintenance. On the benefit side, it requires estimating the potential economic and human cost savings from preventing a terrorist attack. This involves using statistical models to estimate the probability of an attack and the potential damage, factoring in the deterrent effect of the proposed measures. For instance, if the estimated cost of a successful attack on a major Alabama port is $1.5 billion in lost trade and $500 million in direct damage, and the proposed security upgrades cost $50 million annually, a probabilistic analysis might show that the expected annual benefit, probability of attack * cost of attack, significantly outweighs the cost of the upgrades, justifying the expenditure. This approach aligns with the principles of fiscal prudence and evidence-based policymaking, inherent in effective governance, and the spirit of counterterrorism legislation, which aims to protect citizens and economic stability. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the immediate budgetary constraints without a thorough assessment of potential future costs. This might involve implementing only the cheapest available security measures, regardless of their actual effectiveness in mitigating high-impact threats. Such an approach fails to acknowledge the potential for catastrophic losses that far exceed the initial savings, violating the core objective of counterterrorism legislation to prevent significant harm. Another flawed approach would be to allocate funds based on public perception or media attention rather than a data-driven risk assessment. This could lead to overspending on highly visible but less critical security enhancements while neglecting more fundamental, albeit less publicized, vulnerabilities. This deviates from a rational, evidence-based allocation of resources, which is crucial for effective counterterrorism. A final incorrect approach would be to dismiss the need for enhanced security at certain sites due to a perceived low probability of attack, without considering the potential severity of an attack if it were to occur. This overlooks the concept of asymmetric threats, where even low-probability events can have devastating consequences, a consideration central to modern counterterrorism strategy. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing this decision should adopt a systematic, data-driven approach. This involves 1. Clearly defining the scope of the analysis and the specific threats being addressed within the Alabama context. 2. Identifying all relevant costs and benefits, both tangible and intangible, and employing appropriate quantitative methods to estimate them. 3. Utilizing probabilistic modeling to account for uncertainty in threat likelihood and impact. 4. Considering the long-term implications and the deterrent effect of proposed measures. 5. Documenting the entire process and the rationale for the final recommendation to ensure transparency and accountability. Question 11. Quality control measures reveal that a financial institution operating in Alabama has processed a large, unusual wire transfer for a customer with no prior history of such transactions. The transfer's destination is a country known for increased counterterrorism concerns. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the institution to take under the Alabama Anti-Terrorism Act? Option A. Immediately file a suspicious activity report (SAR) with federal law enforcement agencies based on the initial observation of the large transaction and its destination. Option B. Conduct an internal review of the transaction and customer profile, gather supporting documentation, and consult with the compliance officer or legal counsel to assess the situation against reporting requirements before taking further action. Option C. Contact the customer directly to inquire about the purpose and legitimacy of the wire transfer before making any reporting decisions. Option D. Ignore the transaction, assuming it is legitimate, as there is no definitive proof of illegal activity. The correct answer is B. Conduct an internal review of the transaction and customer profile, gather supporting documentation, and consult with the compliance officer or legal counsel to assess the situation against reporting requirements before taking further action. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the sensitive nature of potential terrorist financing and the need to balance robust compliance with operational efficiency. The Alabama Anti-Terrorism Act, like similar legislation, imposes strict reporting obligations and requires financial institutions to implement effective controls to prevent illicit activities. Failure to do so can result in severe penalties, reputational damage, and legal repercussions. The challenge lies in accurately identifying and reporting suspicious activities without unduly disrupting legitimate business operations or infringing on customer privacy rights, all while adhering to the specific mandates of Alabama law. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves a multifaceted strategy that prioritizes thorough investigation and documentation before escalating to law enforcement. This includes conducting an internal review of the transaction history and customer profile, gathering all relevant internal documentation, and consulting with the institution's compliance officer or legal counsel to assess the situation against the reporting thresholds and indicators outlined in the Alabama Anti-Terrorism Act. This methodical process ensures that any report filed is well supported, accurate, and compliant with the Act's requirements for suspicious activity reporting, thereby fulfilling the institution's legal obligations while minimizing the risk of false alarms. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately file a suspicious activity report (SAR) with law enforcement based solely on the initial observation of a single large transaction without further internal investigation. This fails to meet the Act's implicit requirement for a reasonable basis for suspicion, potentially leading to unnecessary investigations and wasted resources for both the institution and law enforcement. It also risks damaging customer relationships and the institution's reputation if the transaction is ultimately found to be legitimate. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the transaction entirely, assuming it is legitimate without any form of internal review. This directly contravenes the spirit and letter of the Alabama Counterterrorism Act, which mandates vigilance and reporting of potentially illicit financial activities. Such inaction constitutes a significant compliance failure and exposes the institution to severe penalties. Finally, attempting to contact the customer directly to inquire about the transaction's purpose before filing a report is a critical error. This action, known as tipping off, is explicitly prohibited by anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing regulations, including those implicitly supported by the Alabama Counterterrorism Act, and can obstruct investigations, leading to severe legal consequences. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should employ a structured decision-making process. First, they must understand the specific reporting triggers and thresholds defined by the Alabama Counterterrorism Act and related federal guidelines. Second, they should initiate an internal investigation to gather facts and context surrounding the suspicious activity. Third, they must consult with internal compliance and legal experts to interpret the findings and determine the appropriate course of action, including whether a SAR is warranted. Fourth, if a SAR is deemed necessary, it must be filed accurately and promptly, with all supporting documentation retained. Throughout this process, maintaining confidentiality and avoiding any action that could be construed as tipping off the customer is paramount. Question 12. Stakeholder feedback indicates a potential counterterrorism threat originating from foreign actors operating within Alabama. To gather intelligence, an analyst proposes initiating electronic surveillance targeting individuals believed to be involved. Considering the strict requirements of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, as applied in the United States, which of the following represents the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action? Option A. Share the intelligence with foreign partners and request they conduct surveillance on their end, as this circumvents the need for a U.S. FISA warrant. Option B. Prepare and submit a detailed application for a FISA warrant to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, FISC, clearly outlining the foreign intelligence or counterterrorism purpose, the specific targets, and the proposed minimization procedures to protect U.S. person privacy. Option C. Initiate immediate electronic surveillance based on the perceived threat, with the intention of seeking exigent circumstances justification for the surveillance after the fact, should legal challenges arise. Option D. Proceed with surveillance based on a general national security directive, assuming that the counterterrorism nature of the threat inherently satisfies FISA probable cause requirements without a specific warrant application. The correct answer is B. Prepare and submit a detailed application for a FISA warrant to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, FISC, clearly outlining the foreign intelligence or counterterrorism purpose, the specific targets, and the proposed minimization procedures to protect U.S. person privacy. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between national security objectives, as pursued through the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, in Alabama, and the privacy rights of individuals. The need to balance effective intelligence gathering with constitutional protections requires meticulous adherence to legal frameworks and a deep understanding of the procedural safeguards embedded within FISA. Missteps can lead to the compromise of critical intelligence, legal challenges, and erosion of public trust. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive review of the proposed surveillance activities against the specific requirements of FISA, as interpreted by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, FISC, and relevant Department of Justice guidelines. This includes ensuring that the application for a FISA warrant is supported by probable cause, clearly articulates the foreign intelligence or counterterrorism purpose, and specifies the minimization procedures to protect the privacy of U.S. persons. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the statutory obligations and judicial oversight mandated by FISA, ensuring that any surveillance is lawful, necessary, and conducted with appropriate safeguards. It prioritizes legal compliance and the protection of civil liberties within the framework established by Congress. An approach that bypasses the formal FISA application process and relies on informal information sharing with foreign partners, even if seemingly efficient for counterterrorism efforts in Alabama, is professionally unacceptable. This failure constitutes a direct violation of FISA procedural requirements, which mandate judicial authorization for electronic surveillance for foreign intelligence purposes. Such an action would undermine the rule of law and expose the intelligence community to significant legal repercussions. Another professionally unacceptable approach would be to proceed with surveillance based on a broad interpretation of national security needs without a specific, individualized warrant application. FISA requires a particularized showing of probable cause for each authorized surveillance. Relying on generalized security concerns without meeting the specific evidentiary standards for a FISA warrant disregards the legal limitations placed on government surveillance powers and the protections afforded to individuals under U.S. law. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on the intelligence value of the information sought, without adequately considering and implementing the minimization procedures required by FISA, is also professionally flawed. FISA mandates that the privacy of U.S. persons be protected to the greatest extent possible. Failure to implement robust minimization procedures, even with a valid FISA warrant, can lead to the unlawful acquisition and retention of information about American citizens, resulting in legal challenges and ethical breaches. Professionals in this domain must adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes a thorough understanding of the legal and procedural requirements of FISA. This involves consulting legal counsel, meticulously documenting all steps, and ensuring that every action taken is within the bounds of the law and consistent with the principles of oversight and accountability. The process should be iterative, with continuous review and validation against statutory mandates and judicial precedent. Question 13. Regulatory review indicates that a group in Mobile, Alabama, has engaged in a series of coordinated acts involving property destruction and the disruption of public transportation, causing significant inconvenience and fear among residents. The group's public statements express strong opposition to a new state environmental policy. Considering the Alabama Counterterrorism Law, which of the following best describes the initial assessment required to determine if these acts constitute terrorism? Option A. Ascertaining whether the acts involve the use or threatened use of violence, and if the intent was to intimidate or coerce the civilian population or influence government policy through intimidation or coercion, as defined by Alabama statutes. Option B. Determining if the acts resulted in widespread injury or death, or significant damage to critical infrastructure, regardless of the specific intent behind the actions. Option C. Focusing on the extent of property destruction and public disruption to assess the severity of the threat, without a detailed examination of the group's specific intent. Option D. Evaluating the media's portrayal of the group's activities and the general public's perception of their actions as terrorist in nature. The correct answer is A. Ascertaining whether the acts involve the use or threatened use of violence, and if the intent was to intimidate or coerce the civilian population or influence government policy through intimidation or coercion, as defined by Alabama statutes. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the accurate application of Alabama's specific legal definition of terrorism in a rapidly evolving situation, where initial information may be incomplete or misleading. Misinterpreting the definition could lead to incorrect reporting, inappropriate resource allocation, or even the wrongful accusation of individuals or groups, with significant legal and ethical ramifications. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between acts that meet the statutory threshold for terrorism and those that do not, based solely on the evidence and the precise wording of the Alabama Counterterrorism Law. The correct approach involves a meticulous comparison of the observed activities against the statutory elements of terrorism as defined in Alabama law. This means identifying whether the actions involve the use or threatened use of violence, whether the intent is to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or influence government policy through intimidation or coercion, and whether the acts are intended to cause widespread injury or death, or significant damage to critical infrastructure. This approach is correct because it adheres strictly to the legal framework established by the Alabama Counterterrorism Law, ensuring that any designation or reporting is grounded in statutory requirements and not on speculation or broader, less precise understandings of terrorism. It prioritizes legal accuracy and due process. An incorrect approach would be to label activities as terrorism based solely on the presence of violence or the potential for widespread harm, without considering the specific intent element required by Alabama law. For instance, attributing terrorism to a protest that turns violent without evidence that the violence was intended to intimidate a civilian population or coerce the government would be a regulatory failure. Similarly, classifying an act as terrorism because it causes significant damage, but lacks the requisite intent to intimidate or coerce, would also be a failure to comply with the statutory definition. Another incorrect approach would be to rely on media portrayals or common public perceptions of terrorism, which may not align with the precise legal definition in Alabama, leading to an overbroad or inaccurate application of the law. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the Alabama Counterterrorism Law's definition of terrorism. When presented with suspicious activities, the process should involve gathering all available factual information, objectively assessing whether each element of the statutory definition is met, and consulting with legal counsel or designated authorities if there is any ambiguity. This systematic, legally grounded approach ensures that actions taken are consistent with the law and uphold the principles of justice and due process. Question 14. Performance analysis shows a need to enhance counterterrorism preparedness within an organization operating in Alabama. Considering the global nature of terrorism, the organization's leadership is exploring the potential utility of counterterrorism legal frameworks developed by the European Union. Which of the following represents the most prudent and legally sound approach for an entity based in Alabama to consider in relation to EU counterterrorism laws? Option A. Directly implement selected EU counterterrorism directives and regulations that appear to offer enhanced security measures, assuming their principles are universally beneficial and supersede local laws. Option B. Adopt a selective approach, incorporating only those EU counterterrorism measures that are easily understood and seem to align with current operational practices, without formal legal review. Option C. Disregard all European Union counterterrorism laws, as they are foreign regulations and have no relevance to counterterrorism efforts within the United States. Option D. Conduct a detailed legal analysis to determine the specific applicability and compatibility of relevant EU counterterrorism principles with Alabama and United States federal law, seeking expert legal counsel to guide any potential integration into existing protocols. Correct answer is D. Conduct a detailed legal analysis to determine the specific applicability and compatibility of relevant EU counterterrorism principles with Alabama and United States federal law, seeking expert legal counsel to guide any potential integration into existing protocols. Explanation. The scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent complexity of applying broad European Union counterterrorism legal frameworks to a specific, localized operational context within Alabama. The core difficulty lies in translating overarching EU directives and regulations, which are designed for member states, into actionable and compliant procedures for an entity operating under U.S. federal and Alabama state law. This requires a nuanced understanding of both legal systems and the potential for misinterpretation or overreach. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any counterterrorism measures adopted are both effective and legally sound within the Alabama jurisdiction, without inadvertently creating conflicts with existing U.S. law or exceeding the entity's mandate. The best approach involves a thorough legal review and consultation process. This entails identifying specific EU counterterrorism measures that might be relevant, e.g., those related to financial intelligence sharing or data protection in a counterterrorism context, and then meticulously assessing their applicability and compatibility with Alabama and U.S. federal law. This would involve engaging legal counsel specializing in both international and U.S. counterterrorism law to determine if and how these EU principles can be ethically and legally integrated into existing operational protocols. The justification for this approach rests on the principle of legal compliance and the avoidance of extraterritorial application of foreign law where it conflicts with domestic statutes. It prioritizes adherence to the established legal framework of Alabama and the United States, ensuring that any adopted practices are grounded in legitimate domestic authority and due process. An incorrect approach would be to directly implement EU counterterrorism regulations without proper legal vetting. This is professionally unacceptable because it risks violating U.S. federal and Alabama state laws, potentially leading to legal penalties, civil liability, and undermining the legitimacy of the entity's operations. Such an approach fails to acknowledge the distinct legal sovereignty of the United States and Alabama. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to ignore any potential relevance of EU counterterrorism frameworks, assuming they have no bearing whatsoever. While direct application may be problematic, EU directives and best practices can sometimes inform domestic policy development or highlight areas for enhanced vigilance. A complete dismissal might lead to missed opportunities for improving counterterrorism strategies by overlooking valuable insights gained from international efforts, even if direct adoption is not feasible. This approach lacks a proactive and comprehensive risk assessment. A third incorrect approach is to selectively adopt parts of EU counterterrorism measures that appear convenient or effective, without considering the broader legal and ethical implications, or the interconnectedness of these measures within the EU framework. This piecemeal adoption can lead to an incomplete and potentially ineffective counterterrorism strategy, while also creating legal inconsistencies and compliance gaps. It demonstrates a superficial understanding of the EU's integrated approach to counterterrorism. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of their operational mandate and the governing legal jurisdiction, Alabama and U.S. federal law. This should be followed by a comprehensive research phase to identify any relevant international frameworks, such as EU counterterrorism laws, that might offer insights or best practices. Crucially, this research must be coupled with rigorous legal consultation to determine the precise applicability and compatibility of these international measures with domestic law. The decision-making process should prioritize legal compliance, ethical considerations, and operational effectiveness, ensuring that any adopted strategies are robust, defensible, and aligned with the established legal order. Question 15. Operational review demonstrates that a large financial institution operating in Alabama is seeking to enhance its compliance with the USA Patriot Act. The institution is considering several strategies to improve its ability to identify and report suspicious activities related to terrorism financing. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the statutory requirements and best practices for implementing the USA Patriot Act? Option A. Adopt a policy of only initiating enhanced due diligence when explicitly instructed by a federal law enforcement agency. Option B. Implement a blanket monitoring system that scrutinizes every customer transaction for any deviation from typical patterns, regardless of risk assessment. Option C. Rely exclusively on a third-party compliance software vendor to manage all aspects of USA Patriot Act compliance without internal policy development or oversight. Option D. Develop and implement comprehensive, risk-based customer identification programs, SIP, and enhanced due diligence (ED) procedures, coupled with regular employee training and robust record-keeping, to proactively identify and report suspicious activities. The correct answer is D. Develop and implement comprehensive, risk-based customer identification programs, SIP, and enhanced due diligence (ED) procedures, coupled with regular employee training and robust record-keeping, to proactively identify and report suspicious activities. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between national security objectives, as embodied by the USA Patriot Act, and the privacy rights of individuals and the operational realities of financial institutions. Balancing the need for effective counterterrorism measures with the imperative to avoid overreach and maintain customer trust requires careful judgment and a thorough understanding of legal obligations. The complexity arises from interpreting broad statutory language and applying it to specific, often nuanced, business practices. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a proactive and comprehensive approach to implementing the USA Patriot Act's requirements. This includes establishing robust internal policies and procedures that are specifically tailored to the institution's operations and risk profile. Such policies should clearly define the scope of customer identification programs, SIP, due diligence procedures for high-risk customers, and suspicious activity reporting, SAR, triggers, Regular training for relevant personnel on these policies and on identifying red flags is crucial. Furthermore, maintaining detailed records of these efforts provides essential documentation for compliance audits and demonstrates a good faith effort to meet statutory obligations. This approach directly aligns with the spirit and letter of the USA Patriot Act by ensuring that the institution has a systematic and documented framework for identifying and reporting potential threats while respecting customer privacy within legal bounds. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves a reactive stance, waiting for specific directives from law enforcement or regulatory bodies before implementing any new measures. This approach fails to meet the proactive intent of the USA Patriot Act, which mandates financial institutions to establish their own programs to prevent their use for illicit purposes. It risks significant penalties for non-compliance and leaves the institution vulnerable to exploitation. Another incorrect approach is to implement overly broad or intrusive measures that go beyond the statutory requirements, such as indiscriminately monitoring all customer communications or transactions without a reasonable basis. This not only can alienate customers and damage reputation, but also may violate privacy laws and create unnecessary operational burdens. Finally, an approach that relies solely on generic off-the-shelf compliance software without tailoring it to the institution's specific risks and operations is insufficient. While software can be a tool, it cannot replace the need for thoughtful policy development and ongoing human oversight to ensure effective implementation of the USA Patriot Act's complex provisions. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such implementation challenges should adopt a risk-based approach. This involves first understanding the specific requirements of the USA Patriot Act as they apply to their institution's business model and customer base. They should then develop clear, written policies and procedures that address these requirements, incorporating input from legal counsel and compliance experts. Regular training and ongoing monitoring are essential to ensure these policies are effectively implemented and updated as needed. Documentation of all compliance efforts is paramount for demonstrating adherence to the law. Question 16. Stakeholder feedback indicates that law enforcement agencies in Alabama are encountering challenges in balancing counterterrorism investigations with the due process rights of individuals. Considering the Alabama Counterterrorism Law and constitutional protections, which of the following approaches best ensures that investigative actions are both effective and legally sound? Option A. Detaining and questioning individuals for extended periods based on generalized concerns about national security, without informing them of their rights, or providing an opportunity to consult legal counsel if their detention escalates beyond a brief, investigatory stop. Option B. Meticulously documenting all observed behaviors and credible intelligence that form the basis for any suspicion, ensuring these observations are specific, articulable, and directly related to potential counterterrorism concerns as defined by Alabama law. Option C. Initiating surveillance and information gathering based solely on an individual's religious affiliation and perceived unusual patterns of life without any specific, articulable facts linking them to potential terrorist activity. Option D. Seeking a search warrant based on vague and unsubstantiated rumors from anonymous sources without independent corroboration or the development of specific, observable facts. The correct answer is B. Meticulously documenting all observed behaviors and credible intelligence that form the basis for any suspicion, ensuring these observations are specific, articulable, and directly related to potential counterterrorism concerns as defined by Alabama law. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the imperative to investigate potential threats under Alabama's counterterrorism laws with the fundamental due process rights of individuals. Law enforcement officers must act decisively to protect public safety, but their actions must also be grounded in legal and ethical principles that safeguard individual liberties. The risk of overreach or the violation of constitutional rights, even with good intentions, necessitates careful consideration of legal boundaries and procedural fairness. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves meticulously documenting all observed behaviors and credible intelligence that form the basis for any suspicion, ensuring these observations are specific, articulable, and directly related to potential counterterrorism concerns as defined by Alabama law. This approach prioritizes gathering objective evidence that can withstand legal scrutiny, thereby upholding due process rights by ensuring that any investigative actions are based on reasonable suspicion or probable cause, as required by the Fourth Amendment and relevant Alabama statutes. This aligns with the principle that suspicion must be more than a mere hunch or generalized fear. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves initiating surveillance and information gathering based solely on an individual's religious affiliation and perceived unusual patterns of life without any specific, articulable facts linking them to potential terrorist activity. This violates due process by relying on discriminatory profiling and subjective interpretations, which are not legally sufficient grounds for suspicion under Alabama law or the U.S. Constitution. Such an approach risks infringing upon freedom of association and religion. Another incorrect approach is to immediately seek a search warrant based on vague and unsubstantiated rumors from anonymous sources, without independent corroboration or the development of specific, observable facts. This fails to meet the probable cause standard required for warrants, as it relies on hearsay and speculation rather than concrete evidence. Due process demands that warrants be supported by oath or affirmation, and a showing of probable cause, which this approach neglects. A third incorrect approach is to detain and question individuals for extended periods based on generalized concerns about national security, without informing them of their rights or providing an opportunity to consult legal counsel if their detention escalates beyond a brief, investigatory stop. This can constitute an unlawful seizure and interrogation, violating Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights, and is not permissible under Alabama's counterterrorism framework, which respects established legal procedures for detention and questioning. Professional reasoning. Professionals must adopt a framework that prioritizes objective evidence and legal standards. This involves a continuous assessment of the information gathered against the requirements of Alabama's counterterrorism laws and constitutional due process guarantees. When faced with potential threats, the decision-making process should involve 1. Identifying specific, articulable facts that suggest illegal activity. 2. Assessing whether these facts rise to the level of reasonable suspicion or probable cause as defined by law. 3. Ensuring all investigative actions are narrowly tailored to the suspected threat and respect individual rights. And 4. Documenting all steps taken and the legal justification for each. This systematic approach ensures accountability and protects against arbitrary or discriminatory actions. Question 17. The efficiency study reveals that Alabama's emergency response agencies are struggling to effectively integrate the operational mandates of the Federal Homeland Security Act into their day-to-day preparedness and response strategies. Considering the need for seamless interagency cooperation and practical application of security protocols, which of the following implementation strategies would best address this challenge? Option A. Develop and conduct comprehensive, multi-agency training exercises that simulate real-world counterterrorism scenarios, focusing on the practical application of Homeland Security Act provisions within Alabama's existing emergency management framework. Option B. Implement a top-down directive mandating increased information sharing between agencies without establishing clear protocols or providing the necessary technological infrastructure for such sharing. Option C. Procure and deploy advanced surveillance technology across the state, assuming that technological superiority will inherently improve response capabilities. Option D. Revise and disseminate updated written standard operating procedures that explicitly detail the requirements of the Homeland Security Act for each agency, without additional practical training. The correct answer is A. Develop and conduct comprehensive, multi-agency training exercises that simulate real-world counterterrorism scenarios, focusing on the practical application of Homeland Security Act provisions within Alabama's existing emergency management framework. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a critical implementation challenge for Alabama's counterterrorism law, specifically concerning the integration of the Homeland Security Act's mandates into existing state emergency response protocols. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing federal directives with state-specific operational realities, ensuring seamless interagency cooperation, and maintaining public trust while enhancing security measures. Careful judgment is required to avoid creating bureaucratic silos or compromising civil liberties in the name of security. The most effective approach involves a comprehensive, multi-agency training program that simulates real-world scenarios, focusing on the practical application of the Homeland Security Act's provisions within Alabama's existing emergency management framework. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the need for practical integration and interagency coordination, which are fundamental to effective homeland security. By simulating scenarios, personnel can practice communication, resource allocation, and decision-making under pressure, ensuring that the mandates of the Homeland Security Act are not just understood theoretically, but are executable in practice. This aligns with the spirit of the Act, which emphasizes preparedness and coordinated response. An approach that prioritizes solely updating written protocols without practical, hands-on training is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a misunderstanding of how complex security measures are implemented. Written protocols alone do not guarantee effective execution, especially under the stress of an actual event. This approach risks creating a disconnect between policy and practice, leaving gaps in preparedness, and potentially leading to miscommunication or delayed responses. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to implement new technology solutions without adequate training or integration into existing workflows. While technology can enhance security, its effectiveness is contingent on personnel's ability to use it proficiently and integrate it seamlessly with other systems. This approach fails to acknowledge the human element in security operations and risks creating an expensive, underutilized system that does not contribute to overall preparedness. Finally, an approach that focuses on increasing surveillance measures without a corresponding emphasis on community engagement and transparency is professionally flawed. While the Homeland Security Act aims to enhance security, it must be implemented in a manner that respects civil liberties and maintains public trust. Overemphasis on surveillance without community buy-in can lead to public alienation, hinder intelligence gathering, and create an environment of fear rather than security. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough assessment of existing capabilities and identifies specific gaps in relation to the Homeland Security Act's requirements. This should be followed by a collaborative planning process involving all relevant state and local agencies. Prioritizing practical, scenario-based training and ensuring that new technologies are fully integrated and supported by trained personnel are crucial steps. Furthermore, any security enhancements must be balanced with a commitment to transparency and community engagement to foster trust and cooperation. Question 18. Compliance review shows that an Alabama-based financial institution is assessing its obligations under the National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, concerning potential counterterrorism measures. Which of the following approaches best ensures adherence to both federal mandates and state-specific legal considerations? Option A. Implement broad data monitoring and information sharing protocols based on a general interpretation of NDAA counterterrorism objectives, assuming that any information gathered will be beneficial for national security without specific legal authorization. Option B. Focus solely on federal NDAA guidance, assuming that federal mandates supersede any state-specific regulations or privacy protections that might be more restrictive. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive review of the specific NDAA provisions relevant to financial institutions, cross-referencing them with Alabama's statutes and administrative codes governing financial privacy and security, and consult with legal counsel specializing in national security and Alabama financial law to develop tailored compliance policies. Option D. Adopt a reactive stance, waiting for specific directives or enforcement actions related to the NDAA before developing or modifying internal counterterrorism compliance procedures. Correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive review of the specific NDAA provisions relevant to financial institutions, cross-referencing them with Alabama's statutes and administrative codes governing financial privacy and security, and consult with legal counsel specializing in national security and Alabama financial law to develop tailored compliance policies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the critical need to balance national security objectives, as outlined by the National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, with the privacy rights and due process considerations of individuals operating within Alabama. The NDAA, particularly provisions related to counterterrorism and national security, can impose significant obligations on various entities, including those involved in financial transactions or data handling. Misinterpreting or misapplying these provisions can lead to severe legal repercussions, reputational damage, and a failure to uphold fundamental rights. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance without overreach or unintended consequences. The best approach involves a thorough and nuanced understanding of the specific provisions of the NDAA as they apply to Alabama's regulatory environment and the entity's operations. This includes identifying any state-specific interpretations or implementing regulations that may further define or constrain the application of federal law. A proactive stance, involving consultation with legal counsel specializing in national security law and Alabama state regulations, is paramount. This ensures that any actions taken are not only compliant with the letter of the law, but also ethically sound and proportionate to the identified risks. This approach prioritizes a comprehensive review of applicable statutes, case law, and administrative guidance to inform policy and operational procedures. An incorrect approach would be to broadly interpret NDAA provisions as granting unfettered authority for surveillance or data collection without specific legal authorization or probable cause. This fails to acknowledge the constitutional protections and statutory limitations that govern such actions, even in the context of national security. Such an interpretation risks violating individual privacy rights and due process, potentially leading to legal challenges and sanctions under both federal and state law. Another incorrect approach is to solely rely on federal guidance without considering Alabama-specific laws or the practical implications for individuals within the state. While the NDAA is federal law, its implementation and enforcement can be influenced by state-level regulations and judicial interpretations. Ignoring these nuances can lead to a compliance framework that is either insufficient or overly restrictive, failing to achieve the intended balance. A further incorrect approach would be to implement broad, indiscriminate data collection or monitoring practices based on generalized concerns about terrorism, without a clear nexus to specific threats or legal mandates. This approach is not only ethically questionable, but also likely to exceed the scope of authority granted by the NDAA and other relevant laws, potentially leading to accusations of profiling and discrimination. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a precise identification of the relevant legal obligations under the NDAA and any corresponding Alabama statutes or regulations. This should be followed by a risk assessment that considers the potential impact on individual rights and liberties. Consultation with legal experts and relevant stakeholders is crucial to develop policies and procedures that are both effective in addressing security concerns and respectful of legal and ethical standards. Continuous monitoring and adaptation of these practices in light of evolving legal interpretations and operational realities are also essential. Question 19. Compliance review shows that an Alabama law enforcement agency is considering expanding its intelligence gathering operations in response to a perceived increase in domestic extremist threats. The agency is debating several approaches to enhance its capabilities. Which of the following approaches best aligns with Alabama's domestic counterterrorism laws and policies? Option A. Share raw, unverified intelligence reports directly with community leaders and the public to raise awareness of potential threats, bypassing formal intelligence analysis and dissemination channels. Option B. Develop internal guidelines that permit the collection of information on individuals based on their religious or ethnic background, as a preliminary step in identifying potential threats. Option C. Initiate broad, proactive surveillance of individuals and locations exhibiting characteristics commonly associated with extremist ideologies, without requiring specific articulable suspicion for each subject. Option D. Establish a joint task force with federal and state agencies, operating under a memorandum of understanding that clearly defines roles, responsibilities, and legal authorities for intelligence collection, analysis, and sharing, with all activities strictly adhering to Alabama's statutory requirements for surveillance and data acquisition. The correct answer is D. Establish a joint task force with federal and state agencies, operating under a memorandum of understanding that clearly defines roles, responsibilities, and legal authorities for intelligence collection, analysis, and sharing, with all activities strictly adhering to Alabama's statutory requirements for surveillance and data acquisition. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the sensitive nature of intelligence gathering and the potential for overreach or misinterpretation of Alabama's domestic counterterrorism laws. Balancing the need for effective intelligence with the protection of civil liberties requires careful judgment and strict adherence to legal frameworks. The best approach involves a multi-agency collaboration that strictly adheres to established protocols for information sharing and intelligence analysis, ensuring all activities are authorized and documented under Alabama's domestic counterterrorism legal framework. This approach is correct because it aligns with the principles of lawful intelligence gathering, which emphasize due process, oversight, and the prevention of unauthorized surveillance or profiling. Alabama law, like federal statutes, generally requires specific legal authorization for intrusive investigative techniques and prohibits the collection of information based on protected characteristics. By involving multiple agencies with defined roles and responsibilities, and by operating within established legal boundaries, this method ensures accountability and minimizes the risk of violating individual rights or exceeding statutory authority. An incorrect approach would be to unilaterally expand surveillance operations based on generalized threat assessments without specific, articulable suspicion or proper legal authorization. This fails to comply with Alabama's domestic counterterrorism laws, which require a factual basis for surveillance and prohibit broad, unfocused investigations. Such an action could lead to violations of privacy rights and potentially be deemed unlawful surveillance. Another incorrect approach would be to focus intelligence gathering efforts primarily on individuals or groups exhibiting certain cultural or religious affiliations, even in the absence of any specific threat indicators. This constitutes profiling and is ethically and legally unacceptable under Alabama law, which prohibits discrimination and requires intelligence efforts to be based on credible threat information, not on protected characteristics. This approach risks alienating communities and undermining legitimate counterterrorism efforts by fostering distrust. A further incorrect approach would be to disseminate raw, unverified intelligence to the public without proper vetting and authorization. This not only compromises ongoing investigations, but also violates protocols designed to protect sensitive information and prevent the spread of misinformation, which can have detrimental effects on public safety and individual reputations. Alabama's counterterrorism framework emphasizes controlled dissemination and verification of intelligence. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that prioritizes legal compliance, ethical considerations, and established operational protocols. This involves 1. Clearly defining the scope and legal basis for any intelligence-gathering activity. 2. Ensuring all actions are authorized by appropriate legal instruments and oversight bodies. 3. Maintaining strict confidentiality and data security. 4. Regularly reviewing and updating protocols to align with evolving legal standards and best practices. And 5. Fostering interagency cooperation within a framework of mutual respect for legal boundaries and individual rights. Question 20. Governance review demonstrates that a financial institution operating in Alabama must enhance its compliance with United Nations resolutions on counterterrorism. The institution's internal audit team has proposed several approaches to measure the effectiveness of their current counter-terrorist financing (CTF) program against these resolutions. If the institution's total transaction volume for the past quarter was 50,000,000 and its transaction monitoring system flagged 250,000 transactions as potentially suspicious, with 10% of these flags directly correlating to known terrorist financing typologies as outlined in relevant UNSCR and FinCEN guidance. And the institution has identified 50,000 customers as high risk based on their geographic location and business activity, which are also aligned with UNSCR risk indicators. What is the most effective quantitative measure of the institution's CTF program's adherence to UN resolutions? Option A. The percentage of flagged transactions that directly correlate to known terrorist financing typologies, calculated as \frac 250,000 times 0, 1050,000,000 times 100%. Option B. The number of suspicious activity reports, SAR, filed related to terrorism financing, assuming 50 SARs were filed in the quarter. Option C. The total number of flagged transactions, representing \frac 250,000,050,000,000 times 100%, of the total transaction volume. Option D. The proportion of high-risk customers identified, representing \frac 50, 000 total customer base times 100 %, assuming a total customer base of 1,000,000. The correct answer is A. The percentage of flagged transactions that directly correlate to known terrorist financing typologies, calculated as \frac 250, 000 times 0, 1050, 000 times 100 %. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the complex interplay between international counterterrorism mandates and Alabama's specific legal framework for financial institutions. The core difficulty lies in translating broad UN resolutions into actionable, quantifiable compliance metrics that can be practically implemented and audited within a state-level regulatory environment. Financial institutions must balance the imperative to prevent illicit financing with the need for clear, measurable, and legally sound operational procedures. Misinterpretation or misapplication of these resolutions can lead to significant regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and a failure to uphold national security objectives. Correct approach analysis. The most effective approach involves a quantitative assessment of the financial institution's existing anti-money laundering (AML) and counter-terrorist financing (CTF) controls against the specific risk indicators derived from relevant UN Security Council resolutions (UNSCR) applicable to Alabama's financial sector. This requires identifying UNSCR that mandate asset freezes, sanctions, or reporting obligations related to terrorist organizations and their financiers. The institution should then calculate the percentage of its customer base that falls within high-risk categories as defined by these UNSCR and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network (FinCEN) guidance, and assess the proportion of transactions flagged by its internal monitoring systems that align with known terrorist financing typologies. This data-driven method ensures that compliance efforts are targeted, measurable, and directly address the identified threats, aligning with the spirit and letter of both international mandates and Alabama's regulatory expectations for financial vigilance. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely rely on qualitative assessments of staff awareness training regarding general counterterrorism principles, without quantifying the impact on transaction monitoring or customer due diligence. This fails to provide measurable evidence of compliance with specific UNSCR obligations and leaves the institution vulnerable to accusations of superficial adherence. Another flawed approach would be to implement broad, untargeted transaction monitoring rules that generate a high volume of false positives, without a clear methodology to link these flags back to specific UNSCR requirements or risk profiles. This approach is inefficient, costly, and does not demonstrate a focused effort to combat terrorism financing as mandated. Finally, an approach that prioritizes compliance with general state banking regulations without explicitly mapping those controls to the specific obligations imposed by UNSCR on terrorist financing would be insufficient. While general compliance is necessary, it does not guarantee adherence to the specialized requirements of international counterterrorism law. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach that systematically translates international mandates into quantifiable operational metrics. This involves 1. Identifying all applicable UNSCR and relevant national implementing regulations, e.g., FinCEN advisories. 2. Conducting a thorough risk assessment to identify high-risk customer segments and transaction patterns relevant to terrorism financing. 3. Developing and implementing specific controls and monitoring systems designed to detect and report suspicious activities aligned with these risks. 4. Quantifying the effectiveness of these controls through metrics such as the percentage of high-risk customers screened, the number of suspicious activity reports filed related to terrorism financing, and the rate of false positives in transaction monitoring. 5. Regularly reviewing and updating these metrics and controls in response to evolving threats and regulatory guidance.